Picture a city that never existed. At its heart, on a low hill ringed by 3 circles of water, stood a temple some 180 meters long, sheathed on the outside in silver, its pinnacles capped with gold. Around the sacred citadel ran 3 great walls, one inside the next. The first was faced with bronze, the second with tin, pale and cold, and the third, the innermost, the wall that wrapped the holy center of the city, was covered from end to end in a metal that no living person has ever seen. A metal, the writer said, flashed with the red light of fire. He called it orichalcum. He wrote that it was dug out of the earth across the island, that it was valued above everything except gold, and that in his own day it survived only as a name. The city was Atlantis. The writer was the Athenian philosopher Plato, setting down around 360 years before our era the most famous story of a lost world ever told. A vast sea power that grew rich, grew proud, made war on the whole Mediterranean, and was swallowed whole by the ocean in a single day and a single night. And here is the problem with that story. Atlantis never existed. Plato invented it. Almost every scholar who has studied the text closely for the last 100 years has reached the same verdict. There was no lost continent, no drowned empire, no sunken kings. But there was a metal. Someone gave it a name and a color and a price. And 2,500 years later, divers would haul that exact metal, gleaming out of the sea off the coast of Sicily. This is the history of Atlantis, told not through the city that was never there, but through the one thing in the whole story you can actually hold in your hand. Start with the metal, because everything in this story hangs from it. Orichalcum. Plato spends real care on it. In the dialogue we call the Critias, he says it was mined in many parts of Atlantis, that it was the most precious of the metals then known save gold, and that the great inner wall of the city gleamed with the red light of orichalcum. The roof of the central temple was ivory, picked out with gold and silver and this third metal. The walls, the pillars, the very floor were clad in it. And at the center stood a single pillar of orichalcum on which the island's sacred laws were carved. So what was it? The name is the first clue. Orichalcum comes from the Greek orichalkos, which means, quite literally, mountain copper, not gold. Copper, the reddish metal, dug from the mountain. And that points straight at the answer that metallurgists now broadly accept. Orichalcum was not a lost or magical element. It was brass, copper, alloyed with zinc, and sometimes a little lead. That is the strange, deflating, wonderful truth at the center of the legend. The fabled fire metal of the drowned utopia is the same yellow alloy as a doorknob, a trumpet, a spent cartridge case. But look closer, because it is not quite so ordinary. A brass heavy in copper, freshly cast and polished, does not look like flat yellow gold. It glows. Under low sun or by firelight, it throws back a warm red gold light. It flashes, exactly as Plato said, with the red light of fire. And to an ancient eye, it had one more quality that must have seemed close to magical. It was a metal pulled from cheap stone that looked very much like gold. That is the material this whole legend is built around. A false gold that gleamed like flame, and a metal that Plato insisted in his own century had already vanished from the world. To understand the metal, you first have to understand the man who named it and why he was writing at all. Plato was not a historian. He was a philosopher, the most influential the West has ever produced, and around 360 B.C., near the end of his life, he wrote 2 linked dialogues. the Timaeus, and the Critias, in which the story of Atlantis appears for the first and only time in all of ancient literature. It appears nowhere before him. He is the source. There is no other, and he wraps it in a very particular chain of hands. The tale, one of his speakers explains, came down from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who had traveled to Egypt more than 2 centuries earlier. There, in the temple city of Sais, aged priests had shown Solon records far older than Greece, and told him of a mighty island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, at the very edge of the known world, larger than Libya and Asia combined. 9,000 years before, they said, this empire had tried to enslave the Mediterranean, had been thrown back by the heroes of an early Athens, and had then been destroyed utterly, sunk beneath the waves in a single terrible day. It is a magnificent setup. It is also, the evidence suggests, a fiction, an elaborate frame that Plato built to lend age and authority to an invented tale, because the story does a job. Plato had spent his life describing the ideal state. In Atlantis, he built its opposite, a rich, proud, expansionist sea power, corrupted by its own greatness, struck down by the gods for its arrogance. It is a parable about hubris, dressed as history. One of his own pupils, it is said, remarked dryly that the man who invented Atlantis was also the man who sank it. And the tale is never even finished. The Critias breaks off in mid-sentence, at the very moment the king of the gods gathers the others to pronounce judgment, abandoned, unfinished, hanging forever on a broken line. But here is what people forget when they wave Atlantis away as pure fantasy. The fear behind it was real. Plato did not invent the idea that the sea could take a city. He was living in a world where it happened. In the winter of 373 BC, when Plato was an old man, alive and working in Athens, a Greek city called Helike on the Gulf of Corinth was destroyed in the dark. An earthquake struck, the sea drew back, and then a wave came in over the town. By morning, Helike was gone, drowned under the water with everyone in it. The Greeks did not read this as geology. They read it as judgment. Poseidon, god of the sea and of earthquakes, punishing the city for some impiety. For centuries afterwards, travelers reported that you could still see the drowned ruins under the clear water, and a bronze statue of the god himself standing upright beneath the surface, snagging the nets of passing fishermen. A whole city swallowed in a night for offending a god. Plato was in his 50s when it happened, a few days' journey away. You do not have to guess whether he knew of it. Everyone knew of it. And Helike was only the most recent. The Aegean world was littered with older drownings. Off the southern coast of Greece, at a place we now call Pavlopetri, an entire Bronze Age town, streets, house foundations, tombs, lies today on the seabed in a few meters of clear water, drowned by the slow rise of the sea more than 3,000 years ago. Further back still, the eruption of the volcano at Thera had torn the heart out of the Bronze Age Aegean and buried a thriving island town under ash. Plato did not need a lost continent to imagine the sea eating a civilization. He had the real thing in memory and in living sight. He simply made his version bigger, older, and further away than anyone could ever check. So, Atlantis was an allegory built by a philosopher out of the real terror of the drowning sea. That should have been the end of it. And it was for a very long time, roughly 2,000 years. The ancient world mostly understood Plato's story for what it was, a teaching tale, The map of the world had no room for a sunken continent, and educated readers did not go hunting for one. Then the modern age fell in love. In 1882, an American named Ignatius Donnelly, a former congressman, published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he argued that Plato's story was literal, sober history, that Atlantis had truly existed, a single advanced mother civilization from which every great culture on earth, Egyptian and Mexican alike, had descended. The book was a sensation. It sold and sold, and it lit a fire that has never gone out. Since Donnelly, Atlantis has been discovered confidently and repeatedly, almost everywhere on the planet, in the Azores, in the Canary Islands, off the coast of the Bahamas, in the marshes of southern Spain, in the Aegean at Santorini, even beneath the ice of Antarctica. Each generation finds it again in whatever ocean lies nearest to hand, and each time the physical proof fails to arrive, because the floor of the Atlantic has now been mapped sonar line by sonar line, and there is no drowned continent lying on it. There is quite simply nowhere for Atlantis to be. And still, we look, because the story answers something in us. It offers a golden age, a lost perfection, punished and swallowed, but perhaps recoverable. A paradise we might yet dredge back up into the light. The map of Atlantis has never really been a map of the sea floor. It is a map of a longing, the wish that somewhere, under the water, the better world we feel we have lost is still down there waiting with its temples of fire-colored metal intact. Now go back to the metal, because the metal is where the myth touches the ground. Orichalcum was brass, and brass in the ancient world was genuinely difficult and genuinely strange. Copper is old. Humans had worked it for thousands of years. Add tin, and you get bronze, the metal that gave a whole age its name. But brass needs zinc, and zinc is a problem. Pure zinc boils and turns to vapor at a lower temperature than copper even melts. Drop a lump of zinc into a crucible of molten copper, and it does not alloy. It simply burns off in a white smoke and is gone. For most of antiquity, no one could make brass on purpose by the obvious route, because they had no way to hold the zinc in place long enough to marry it to the copper. So they found a sideways trick. They took copper and broke a zinc-bearing ore, a stone the old writers called calamine, into small pieces and packed the two together with charcoal inside a sealed vessel and heated it hard. Shut away from the open air, the ore gave up its zinc not as a liquid, but as a vapor, and that vapor soaked directly into the solid copper, coloring it from the inside out. They called the method cementation. It produced out of a red metal and a gray stone a third thing that came out the color of gold. That is what made brass feel like alchemy long before alchemy had a name. You put in copper, which is cheap, and calamine, which is a rock, and you took out something the color of the sun, and its exact shade depended on the recipe. Push the copper high and the zinc low, and the metal glows warm, reddish, almost the color of fire, which is precisely the shade Plato reaches for. Not the flat yellow of a modern brass fitting, the deep red gleam of a high copper alloy, freshly polished, catching a low light. The fire metal was not poetry, it was chemistry. And then orichalcum did something no lost metal is supposed to do. It became ordinary. Plato had written around 360 BC that the fire metal was already gone, remembered only as a word, but within a few centuries the word came roaring back, not in a temple and not in legend, but in the most unromantic place imaginable, in the coin. By the reign of the Emperor Augustus, the Romans were minting money out of exactly this alloy. They called it orichalcum. They had quietly rebuilt the Greek mountain copper into a Latin gold copper, because that is what it looked like. And they used this golden brass for real circulating coinage, the sestertius and the dupontius, coins worth more than the plain copper ones, valued in part for the warm shine of the metal itself. Consider what that means. The fabled substance that clad the temples of a drowned paradise, the metal Plato swore had vanished from the earth, ended its career as small change, jingling in the purse of a legionary, handed across a counter for bread and wine, stamped with the face of an emperor and worn smooth by 10,000 ordinary hands. The recipe was no secret now. The Romans understood the cementation trick well enough to make brass by the ton, and their soberer writers knew exactly what orichalcum was: a copper-zinc alloy, useful, handsome, and entirely explicable. So the word had made a strange journey. It began as the name of an almost sacred material, the fire that sheathed a god's temple at the center of the world, and it ended as an accountant's term for a denomination of coin. From the myth of Atlantis to the petty cash of an empire, the same metal, the same name, drained of all its magic. And there it might have rested forever, a footnote in the history of money, except that the sea had quietly kept a cargo. On the southern coast of Sicily sits the old town of Gela, today an industrial port, but once one of the richest Greek colonies in the Western world, founded nearly 7 centuries before our era by settlers from Rhodes and Crete. Just off its shore, in shallow water, only a few meters deep and about 300 meters out, lie the remains of a small ancient ship. It was found in 1988, and from the pottery scattered around it, archaeologists dated the wreck to the end of the 6th century before our era, roughly 2,500 years old. A modest trading vessel coasting the Mediterranean that went down within sight of land and settled quietly into the sand. For years, the wreck gave up ordinary things, and then, in 2015, divers working the site brought up something that stopped the excavation cold. Lying in the seabed were ingots, dozens of small cast bars of a bright, pale metal, heaped where they had spilled from the breaking hull. 39 of them came up that season. They were sent for analysis, and the results read like a line lifted from the Critias. The ingots were an alloy of copper and zinc, brass, running by the tests around 75 to 80% copper and 15 to 20% zinc, with faint traces of nickel, lead, and iron. They were, by any real definition of the word, orichalcum. 2 years later, divers recovered a second hoard from the same seabed, 47 more of the bars, lying near a scatter of ancient bronze helmets. The news went around the world in a single phrase. The metal of Atlantis, it said, had been found. That phrasing was a headline, not a fact. These bars were never anywhere near Plato's imaginary island, but the deeper truth underneath the hype was, if anything, better. And it is worth getting exactly right, because these ingots are not treasure looted from a sunken continent. They are something quieter and far more real. They are raw material. Cast into neat, stackable bars, they were cargo. Brass bound for a foundry in the boom town of Gela, where a metal worker would have melted them down and beaten or cast them into whatever the colony's temples and rich houses wanted. Fittings, mirrors, ornament, the gleaming trim of a shrine. This was a shipment of the fire metal in transit on an ordinary commercial day when the ship it rode on slipped under the sea and kept it safe for 2,500 years. Stop and take in what that is. Plato wrote that orichalcum was known only by name. For 24 centuries that was quite literally true. It was a word in an old book, a color in a story, a metal that clad the walls of a city no one could ever find. You could read about it, you could not point to it, and now you can. It sits today in a museum in Gela, rows of small, dull, bright bars behind glass lifted from the mud of the seabed. You can stand in front of the fabled fire metal of the Atlantis legend and simply look at it. In the right light, it still throws back that faint, warm gleam, and it is, as far as anyone can tell, among the earliest worked brass ever raised from the floor of the Mediterranean. The city dissolved into rumor. The kings, the canals, the temples, the drowned continent, all of it is vapor, unprovable, almost certainly imaginary. But the one substance Plato troubled to name and describe and price turned out to be a real thing that a real ship was really carrying. The myth was a story. The metal was cargo. And the cargo survived. This is the quiet power of a single named material. It is the one thread in the whole shining fantasy that you can take hold of and pull and follow all the way down into the hard world and watch it hold. Everything else about Atlantis floats free of proof. How large was the island? As large as Plato says, which is to say, impossibly. Where did it stand? Nowhere the mapped sea floor allows. Who were its kings? Its engineers? Its priests? Names in a parable, no more real than the characters in any other tale a philosopher invented to make a point. But orichalcum can be checked. Plato did the one thing a pure fantasist never has to do. He gave a detail that the real world could confirm or deny. He named a specific metal. He gave it a color, red, like fire. He gave it a value, second only to gold. He gave it an origin, dug from the earth. And every one of those claims turns out to describe a genuine substance, a high copper brass, that gleams warm red when it is polished, made from ore taken out of the ground, prized in the early days when few smiths could make it, and it passed at a glance for gold. The most fantastical story in the ancient world contains, buried inside it, one perfectly sober, perfectly accurate piece of metallurgy. That does not make Atlantis real. It makes Plato a careful writer who reached for a true material to lend weight to an invented world, exactly as a good novelist still does today. But it means the legend is not pure smoke. There is a hard grain at the center of it, and that grain is the metal. Pull the myth away and orichalcum remains heavier, older, and more honest than the story that made its name. And there is one more truth the metal drags up with it out of the dark. Because the deepest thing about the Atlantis story is not that it is false. It is that the fear underneath it is entirely permanently true. The sea really does take the world. It has done it again and again. We have already stood over Pavlopetri, the Bronze Age town on the Greek seabed. But that is a small and recent example of something enormous. At the height of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice that the oceans stood some 120 meters lower than they do today. Whole countries lay in the open air, where there is now nothing but water. Between Britain and mainland Europe, there stretched a broad, low, inhabited plain, a drowned world that archaeologists now call Doggerland, walked by people, hunted over, lived on. And then, as the ice melted, the sea rose and took all of it, coastline by coastline, generation by slow generation. Every one of those vanished shores was somebody's home. The sea has swallowed more human ground than every war we have ever fought combined. Somewhere in the deep memory of every coastal people lies the same buried recollection. The water was lower once, and then it came, and the old land went under, and it did not come back. Plato dressed that memory in orichalcum and gold and made it a moral fable about pride. But the raw material of it, the drowning itself, is one of the truest stories we have. And it is not finished. The sea is rising again in our own century toward coasts and cities that are very much not imaginary. Atlantis is a lie about a real thing. The city was never there, but the water and what it does and what it keeps, that was never once in doubt. Plato wrote that orichalcum survived in his day only as a name. For 24 centuries, he was right. The city was a story. The fire metal was a word. And the whole shining apparatus of Atlantis, the silver temple, the golden pinnacles, the 3 great walls of bronze and tin and flame-colored brass, existed nowhere but on the page and in the longing of everyone who ever read it. Then a small ship that had gone down off Sicily, carrying an ordinary cargo on an ordinary voyage, gave the name a body. Go back one last time to that innermost wall, the one that was meant to blaze with red light around the sacred heart of the drowned city. It never stood. No mason ever clad it. There was no citadel, no ringed island, no continent sinking in a day and a night. All of that is smoke, and always was, but the metal was real. Someone, somewhere, really did take red copper and gray stone and coax out of them a substance that flashed like fire, and cast it into bars and load it onto a boat and lose it to the sea, and leave it lying in the sand for us to raise again and test and name at last and hold. That is the strange bargain at the bottom of this whole story. The great things, the empire, the golden age, the perfect city, were never real and are never coming back. It is the small, hard, unglamorous thing that lasted, a heap of dull metal bars in a glass case in Gela. Atlantis is what we lost and go on hunting and will never find, because it was never there to find. Orichalcum is the piece of it that came back. The city is a rumor, the metal you can hold in your hand.